In the soaring nave of the Reims Cathedral in July of 1429, the destiny of a nation was being reborn. A young, seemingly defeated Charles VII was finally being crowned King of France, the culmination of a miraculous military campaign that had defied all odds. At the heart of this miracle was a visionary peasant girl, a shepherdess who had become a warrior, Joan of Arc. And standing in the place of highest honor, right beside his newly anointed king, was one of her greatest champions and most loyal brothers-in-arms. He was Gilles de Rais, a marshal of France, a brilliant commander, and a celebrated hero of the realm. He was the living embodiment of medieval chivalry, a man of profound piety, immense wealth, and unquestionable courage. No one present in the cathedral that day, watching this golden hero at the apex of his glory, could have possibly imagined the truth. No one could have known that behind the nobleman's virtuous facade lurked a monster, a man who would soon retreat to his dark castles to indulge a secret life of depravity so extreme it would make him one of the most prolific and diabolical serial killers in all of human history. Born in 1404 into one of the most illustrious and powerful families in Brittany, Gilles de Rais was destined for a life of power and prestige. Orphaned at a young age, he was raised by his ambitious maternal grandfather, who ensured he received a first-class education in both classical literature and the brutal arts of war. He was a man of immense contradictions from the start, a deeply learned man who was also prone to fits of violent rage, a connoisseur of fine art who possessed a savage and impulsive nature. He inherited a staggering fortune, becoming one of the wealthiest men in all of France, with a vast portfolio of castles and estates scattered across the countryside. When the 100 Years' War reached its desperate final stages, he answered the call to defend his nation. He proved to be a gifted and fearless military commander. He first met Joan of Arc in 1429 and was immediately captivated by her divine mission. He became one of her most devoted commanders, using his personal fortune to fund her army. He fought bravely beside her at the legendary siege of Orleans, the pivotal battle that shattered the myth of English invincibility. He was instrumental in the subsequent Noailles campaign, a series of stunning victories that cleared the path to Reims for the king's coronation. For his service in valor, the newly crowned King Charles VII granted him the title of Marshal of France, the highest military honor in the kingdom. At the age of just 25, Gilles de Rais had reached the pinnacle of French society. He was a living legend. But the capture and execution of Joan of Arc by the English and their Burgundian allies in 1431 seems to have marked a profound and dark turning point in his life. The man who had been so inspired by her divine quest seemed to lose his own sense of purpose. He largely retired from active military service and retreated from the royal court, isolating himself in his vast collection of castles, particularly his favorite, the imposing and remote fortress of Tiffauges. With no more wars to fight, Gilles turned his immense energy and fortune to a new obsession: the theater. His ego, once fed by the glories of battle, now demanded a different kind of spectacle. He commissioned a massive theatrical production, a play he had written himself, called Passed, The Siege of Orleans, which was a lavish tribute to his own military exploits alongside Joan. The production was a spectacle of almost insane extravagance. It had a cast of over 140 actors, more than 600 custom-made jewel-encrusted costumes, and an entire cathedral organ that was dismantled, transported, and reassembled just for the musical score. This single production was so monstrously expensive, but it almost single-handedly bankrupted him, forcing him to begin selling off his ancestral lands and castles piece by piece. His own concerned family, watching him squander his inheritance, eventually had the king issue a royal decree forbidding him from selling any more of his property. Financially ruined and blocked from selling his own lands, the fallen hero grew desperate. He turned his attention from the arts to a much darker and more secretive pursuit, the occult. He became consumed by the idea of alchemy, the mystical art of turning lead into gold. He surrounded himself with a coterie of sorcerers, mystics, and charlatans, all of whom promised to help him restore his fortune in exchange for a share of the profits. He was searching for the Philosopher's Stone, but what he found was a direct path to his own damnation. The most influential and sinister of these figures was an Italian cleric and occultist from Florence named Francesco Prelati. Prelati was a master manipulator, a man who played upon Gilles' arrogance, his desperation, and his spiritual pride. He claimed to be a master of demonology, and he made Gilles a tantalizing promise. He told him he could help him summon a powerful and ancient demon named Baron. This demon, Prelati claimed, could grant Gilles everything he desired: unlimited knowledge, the power to dominate his enemies, and, most importantly, the wealth to restore his lavish lifestyle. All the demon required in exchange was a pact, a contract sealed with a series of offerings. Gilles de Rais, the man who'd once fought in a holy war beside a saint, now chose to sell his soul to a demon. He had reached the precipice of evil, and he was about to take the final, horrifying step. The pact was made. In the secret candle-lit chambers of his castles, Gilles de Rais and his sorcerer, Prelati, began their forbidden rituals to summon the demon Baron. At first, the offerings required were simple enough: the hearts, the hands, and the eyes of animals, sacrificed on a profane altar. But as the experiments failed to produce the promised gold, Prelati informed his master that the demon was displeased. Baron required a far more potent and sinister price for his services. He demanded the souls of the innocent. He demanded human sacrifice. For Gilles de Rais, there was no turning back. His descent into depravity now became a free fall. It was in the service of this dark pact that his secret life as a predator began. He and his most loyal and trusted servants, men like his valet, Poitou, his cousin, Gilles de Sillé, and a brutish man-at-arms named Henriet Griard, formed a hunting party. But their prey was not animals. They began to abduct children from the villages and countryside surrounding his many castles. The victims were almost always the same: young boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 14. They were the children of poor peasant families, children whose disappearance would go largely unnoticed, children whose parents had no power to seek justice from a great and powerful lord like the Marshal of France. The methods of abduction were varied and cruel. Sometimes the servants would lure a child to one of the castles with a promise of a better life, a job as a page boy, a place in the castle's religious choir, or with simple gifts of food and money. Other times, the approach was more direct. A boy walking alone on a country road would simply be snatched, a sack thrown over his head, and spirited away to the fortress. Once they passed through the castle gates, they entered a world of unimaginable horror from which they would never return. The occult rituals were a sham, a convenient excuse for what was truly taking place. The trial records, based on the detailed and corroborated confessions of Gilles' own servants, and eventually Gilles himself, paint a horrifying and unambiguous picture. This was not just murder for a ritual sacrifice. Gilles de Rais was a sexual sadist. Inside the locked and soundproof chambers of his castles, the children were subjected to the most extreme and brutal forms of torture and sexual abuse before being killed. Gilles was not a distant commander of these horrors. He was an active, eager, and obsessive participant. He was a connoisseur of suffering, an artist whose medium was the agony of his victims. His confession revealed a deeply pathological and twisted mind. He spoke with a chilling detachment about his fascination with the moment of death. He described how, after the killings, he would have the bodies cleaned and often dressed in fine clothes. He would have them arranged in rows, and he would spend hours admiring them, commenting on which had the most beautiful heads or the most graceful limbs. He was a collector of death. For nearly a decade, from roughly 1442 to 1440, he carried on this secret slaughter. The official charges at his trial listed the murders of over 140 children, a number he confessed to, but the true number is believed to be much, much higher, possibly as many as 300. The cellar of his favorite castle, the Château de Tiffauges, was found to contain a massive quantity of charred bones and human remains. For years, his heroic reputation and his immense power provided a perfect shield. The whispers among the peasantry about the scores of missing children were dismissed as superstitious gossip. But his arrogance and his dwindling finances were his undoing. His crimes were finally exposed, not because the authorities launched a long overdue investigation into the missing children, but because he made a foolish political mistake. In a brazen act of aggression, GL got into a violent dispute with a clergyman over a property matter and had the man kidnapped. This act against a man of the church, a direct challenge to ecclesiastical authority, finally gave his enemies the opening they needed. The powerful Bishop of Nantes, now armed with a legitimate reason, launched a formal investigation. The investigation, at first focused on the kidnapping, soon uncovered the years of dark rumors that had swirled around the barons' castles. The bishop began to collect testimony from the terrified locals, and the horrifying truth of the monster of Tiffauges began to take shape. In September of 1440, Gilles de Rais, the hero of France, was arrested and charged with heresy, sodomy, and the mass murder of children. At first, he was arrogant and defiant, mocking the ecclesiastical court and relying on his noble status to protect him. But then, his own loyal servants were brought to the stand. Under the threat of their own torture and execution, their code of silence shattered. One by one, they confessed to everything. They described in horrifying detail their roles in luring the children, the sounds they heard from the torture chamber, and the gruesome task of burning the bodies in the castle's fireplaces and burying the remains to hide the evidence. The weight of their testimony was crushing. Faced with the irrefutable evidence from his own men and threatened with excommunication and torture, the hero finally broke. Gilles de Rais gave a full, tearful, and shockingly detailed public confession, admitting to his monstrous crimes and begging for God's forgiveness. The man who had fought beside a saint confessed that he had been serving a demon. Gilles de Rais was found guilty and sentenced to be both hanged and burned. He met his fate in October of 1440, a fallen hero and an exposed monster. His story is one of the most terrifying and stark examples of the duality of man in all of history. He was at once a celebrated national hero and a depraved serial killer who operated with impunity for years. His horrific secret life is widely believed to be the historical inspiration for the famous Bluebeard fairy tale, the story of a wealthy and powerful nobleman who murders he is passionate in nothing, safely, and death. Gilles de Rais's legacy is a chilling reminder that the most diabolical acts are often committed not by obvious monsters, but by those who are most respected, powerful, and who hide their true nature behind a mask of nobility. To address the Emperor of Rome in the latter half of the 1st century, you could not simply call him Caesar or Augustus. Our Caesar is the center, which is called him Caesar or Augustus. You had to address him by his own command as Dominus and Deus, Master and God. This was not a title granted to him by a foreign senate after his death. It was a demand for worship from a living, breathing man. This was the world of Domitian, an emperor so consumed by a deep-seated insecurity and a cold, intellectual cruelty that he built a fortress of paranoia around himself. He was a ruler whose most diabolical creations were not brazen bulls or forests of the impaled, but intricate and terrifying instruments of psychological warfare. To understand a man, you must first understand the shadow he grew up in. He was the second son of the Emperor Vespasian, a rough, no-nonsense soldier who had clawed his way to power and founded the Flavian dynasty. Domitian's father and his older brother, Titus, were celebrated military heroes. They had commanded the legions, crushed the great Jewish revolt, and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. They were men of action, beloved by the army and the people. Domitian, by contrast, was the awkward, overlooked younger son. While his father and brother were winning glory on the battlefields of the East, he was left behind in Rome, a teenager with no military experience and no real power. He was an intellectual, a poet, a man who preferred the quiet of the library to the chaos of the camp. He grew up surrounded by the towering reputations of his family, nursing a profound and bitter inferiority complex. He was the spare heir, the second son, the one who was not a soldier. This deep-seated resentment, this feeling of being constantly measured and found wanting, would curdle over the years into a dangerous and paranoid form of tyranny. When his brother Titus died, after a brief and popular reign, Domitian finally ascended to the throne in 81 AD. His early reign was, on the surface, efficient and even successful. He was a skilled administrator who revalued the currency, engaged in a massive building program to restore the city of Rome, and governed the provinces with a stern but competent hand. But from the very beginning, his relationship with the Roman Senate was poisoned by his own insecurity. He saw the senators, the proud aristocrats from ancient families, not as partners in governance, but as rivals who looked down on him. The non-military emperor from a new, upstart dynasty. He despised them, and he would spend his reign making them fear him. The great turning point, the moment his simmering paranoia boiled over into a full-blown reign of terror, came in the year 89 AD. The governor of Upper Germany, a man named Lucius Antonius Saturninus, launched a rebellion against him. The revolt was quickly and brutally crushed, but it shattered what was left of Domitian's ability to trust. He became utterly convinced that the conspiracy was far-reaching, that the Senate was riddled with secret traitors who were just waiting for their chance to strike him down. And so he decided to strike them first. He unleashed his own unthinkable creation, a perfectly engineered climate of absolute fear, managed by a vast network of professional informers known as the delatores. These were men who made their living from accusing others of treason. Under Domitian, their power became immense. He expanded the treason laws, the maestas, to cover not just actions, but words, jokes, and even thoughts. Any citizen could be an informer, and the rewards were great: a share of the condemned person's confiscated property. Roman society began to turn on itself. A historian who wrote favorably about Republican heroes was executed. A man who named his slaves after Domitian's favorite eunuchs was crucified. A casual remark at a dinner party, a joke told in private, could be reported by a servant or a disgruntled family member, leading to a swift accusation, a sham trial, and a death sentence. The city of Rome, particularly for the elite, became a quiet, terrifying prison of the mind, where every word had to be weighed, and every acquaintance was a potential executioner. To protect himself from the assassins he saw everywhere, Domitian had the walls of the palace porticos where he took his daily walks lined with highly polished mirror-like moonstone so that he could always see what was happening behind his back. Having established this climate of absolute fear, where every senator who entered his presence was a potential traitor, Domitian decided to conduct his masterpiece. He would gather the most powerful men in Rome, not for a trial or an execution, but for a simple dinner party, an evening that would become the most terrifying night of their lives, and a perfect demonstration of his diabolical, twisted mind. The invitations to the imperial dinner arrived on polished wax tablets, each bearing the unmistakable seal of the Flavian dynasty. For the senators of Rome, these summons were never mere social calls. They were pronouncements that could herald either great favor or utter ruin. But the invitation for this particular evening carried an especially heavy weight of foreboding. Whispers had been circulating throughout the city, tales of Domitian's increasing paranoia, of senators being arrested on flimsy pretexts, of midnight executions in the imperial gardens. To be summoned to the emperor's private table now felt less like an honor and more like a prelude to the scaffold. When the appointed night arrived, the senators, their faces carefully masked with forced smiles and nervous deference, made their way to the sprawling imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. They expected to be led to one of the familiar, opulent dining halls, ablaze with torches and filled with the reassuring sounds of clinking silverware and forced laughter. Instead, silent, grim-faced palace guards directed them deeper into the labyrinthine complex, through unfamiliar corridors, until they reached a smaller, nondescript chamber. As the heavy bronze doors creaked shut behind them, sealing them within, a palpable wave of dread washed over the assembled dignitaries. The room was an unsettling void. Every surface, the walls, the vaulted ceiling, the meticulously polished marble floor, had been painted a uniform, stark, matte black. Even the luxurious stone couches, upon which Roman diners traditionally reclined, were draped in somber black linens. The only sources of light were a handful of smoky, flickering oil lamps, each positioned precariously above a designated couch, their weak flames doing little to pierce the oppressive darkness. Instead, they seemed to amplify the encroaching shadows, turning familiar shapes into menacing specters. The air hung heavy, with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. This was not a dining room. It was a meticulously prepared stage for a macabre performance, a chamber designed to strip away their comfort and confront them with their own mortality. Then, as their eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, the senators noticed the place settings. At each spot, where one might expect a simple tablet bearing a guest's name, stood a small, exquisitely polished black column of stone. The shape was instantly recognizable. A stela, the traditional Roman tombstone, a marker of death and remembrance. And on each of these miniature monuments, carved in shimmering, ghostly silver lettering that seemed to catch the meager lamplight, was the name of one of the invited guests. A collective gasp, stifled and choked with rising panic, rippled through the room. The forced pleasantries they had rehearsed on their journey to the palace died unspoken on their lips. This was no longer a dinner party. This was a carefully orchestrated funeral. Their own. As the senators sat frozen in a state of profound and paralyzing terror, their minds racing with unspeakable possibilities, the performance Domitian had so meticulously planned began to unfold. A troop of young boys, their bodies painted entirely in a stark, unsettling black, from the crowns of their shaved heads to the soles of their bare feet, glided silently into the room. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and eerily graceful, like specters risen from the underworld. They performed a bizarre and terrifyingly silent, funereal dance around the petrified senators, their black bodies weaving through the gloom like harbingers of death. Then, these ghostly figures began to serve the meal. Each course that was presented was, in itself, a morbid spectacle. The food had been deliberately transformed into shades of black, meats burned to a crisp, fish dyed with the inky secretions of squid, and dishes prepared with naturally dark ingredients like black olives and bitter herbs. All of it was arranged on heavy black serving platters, further enhancing the funereal atmosphere. The very act of eating, normally a source of convivial pleasure, now felt like a ritualistic consumption of their own demise. The wine, too, when poured into their goblets, appeared thick and dark, like the waters of the river Styx. Throughout this entire surreal and agonizing ordeal, Domitian was the only figure of composure. He reclined on his own black-draped couch, a faint, almost imperceptible, cruel smile playing on his lips. He surveyed his terrified guests with an air of detached amusement, savoring the palpable fear that saturated the air. A fear so thick it could almost be tasted. As his high-ranking guests sat there, too petrified to even feign hunger or engage in forced conversation, the emperor began his monologue. His voice, in stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere, was soft, almost conversational, yet every word carried the weight of absolute power and veiled menace. He spoke of mortality, of the fragility of human life, and the swift, often brutal, end that awaited all men, even the most powerful. He recounted historical anecdotes of senators and conspirators who had plotted against emperors, their treachery ultimately leading to their bloody and ignominious deaths. He spoke of the necessity of loyalty, the vigilance required to root out treason, and the swift and terrible justice that awaited those who dared to betray their sovereign. He never accused anyone directly, never pointed a finger or raised his voice. Instead, he allowed his carefully chosen words, heavy with implication and dripping with veiled threats, to hang in the suffocating silence of the black room, allowing each man's own guilty conscience, their own fears of his unpredictable nature, and their mounting terror to do the work for him. He was the ultimate puppet master, pulling the invisible strings of their deepest anxieties. He was a predator, toying with his captured prey, and he was savoring every single moment of their drawn-out, psychological agony. They were attending their own wake, forced to contemplate their own deaths while in the presence of the man who held their lives in his capricious hands. The second, for what felt like an eternity, the senators endured this carefully orchestrated torment, each man convinced that the moment the macabre meal concluded, the Praetorian Guard would storm the room and carry out a pre-planned massacre. The silence was punctuated only by the emperor's soft, unsettling voice and the occasional, almost imperceptible, nervous rustle of a senator shifting uncomfortably on his black-draped couch. Finally, just as the tension in the room reached an almost unbearable crescendo, Domitian clapped his hands together, the sharp sound echoing for the oppressive stillness. He announced, with a casual wave of his hand, that the evening's entertainment was over. He dismissed them with a curt nod, telling them they were free to depart. The senators, physically shaken and emotionally shattered men, stumbled out of the black room and into the brightly lit palace corridors, each step taken with the agonizing expectation of feeling a cold blade between their shoulder blades at any moment. But the emperor's guards did not draw the swords. Instead, the departing senators were met by a contingent of silent palace servants, and these servants were bearing farewell gifts from their gracious host. For each senator, They presented the silver cup from which he had been forced to drink the dark wine, the black plate from which he had barely touched the morbid fare, and, most chillingly of all, the small, polished black tombstone that bore his name. It was the final, diabolical twist of the knife. He was not just letting them leave, he was sending them home with a tangible memento of the night he had made them attend their own funeral. He wanted them to place that miniature tombstone on the mantels in their opulent villas, in their private study rooms, a permanent, physical reminder that their lives, their power, their very sanity were his to manipulate, to toy with, to extinguish whenever his whim dictated. The terror of that black banquet was not meant to end when they left the palace walls. It was meant to follow them home, to haunt their waking hours and their nightmares, a constant, silent testament to the absolute and arbitrary power of Dominus and Deus. Domitian's long reign, built on a foundation of paranoia and psychological terror, eventually turned even his closest allies against him. The final conspiracy to end his tyrannical rule was hatched in the very heart of his own imperial palace, involving his chamberlains, his most trusted court officials, and even, according to some accounts, his own wife, Domitia Longina, who had allegedly discovered her own name inscribed on one of his meticulously prepared execution lists. In the year 96 AD, they ambushed him in his bedchamber, and after a violent struggle, the self-proclaimed master and god was stabbed to death. In the aftermath of his assassination, the Roman Senate, the very body he had systematically terrorized and humiliated for 15 long years, issued a damnatio memoriae against him, a symbolic and desperate attempt to erase his memory from the historical record. His name was chiseled off public buildings, his statues were torn down and defaced, and his achievements were deliberately downplayed. But despite their efforts, Domitian's legacy endured, not in stone or bronze, but in the chilling tales of his calculated cruelty and the profound psychological fear he so masterfully engineered. His story remains a potent and unsettling reminder that the most twisted minds are not always the loudest or the most overtly violent, but are sometimes the most intelligent, the most deeply insecure, and the most terrifyingly patient in their pursuit of absolute control. The Black Banquet became a legend, a chilling anecdote whispered through the centuries, a testament to an emperor whose diabolical genius lay not in physical brutality alone, but in the exquisite torment of the human mind. In the year 212 BC, near the grand new capital of the fledgling Chinese Empire, a massive pit was dug into the earth. Into this pit, 460 of the empire's most respected scholars, the intellectual heart of the old order, were thrown. They were not granted the mercy of a quick beheading or a silent dose of poison. On the direct orders of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, they were buried alive. As the dirt was shoveled over their struggling bodies, their screams muffled by the earth, a terrifying message was being sent to all under heaven. This was not just an act of mass murder, it was a statement. It was the diabolical act of a ruler who sought not only to conquer the land, but to conquer thought itself, to erase the past and ensure that all of history began with him. To understand the mind of the man who would commit such an act, you must first understand the brutal world that created him. He was born Ying Zhen, a prince of the state of Qin, during the final, bloody phase of China's siege of sieges, warring states period. For over 200 years, 7 rival kingdoms had been locked in a near-constant cycle of total war. This was an age of unimaginable violence, where armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and massacres of entire civilian populations were a common tool of statecraft. Yingzheng grew up in a world that taught him one simple, ice-cold lesson. Power was the only reality, and absolute, ruthless force was the only path to survival. The state of Qin, located on the rugged western frontier, had embraced this brutal reality more than any other. They were governed by a radical and deeply cynical political philosophy known as Qin legalism. Legalism taught that human beings are inherently selfish, stupid, and untrustworthy. It believed that ideas like morality, tradition, and compassion were dangerous weaknesses that led to chaos. The only way to forge a strong, orderly state, the legalists argued, was through absolute, centralized power and a system of harsh, predictable, and utterly inescapable punishments for even the smallest of crimes. It was a diabolical worldview that saw the individual human being not as a citizen to be nurtured, but as a cog to be controlled in a vast, impersonal state machine. This was the philosophy that Yingzheng would use to end the age of chaos and create China. Ascending to the throne of Qin as a young boy, he came of age and unleashed a military blitzkrieg upon the other 6 kingdoms. His armies, disciplined and merciless, swept across the land, fueled by the legalist promise of rewards for success and brutal punishment for failure. One by one, the other states fell, often in a tide of blood. In 221 BC, the final enemy was vanquished. The warring states period was over. Yingzheng, the king of Qin, was now the master of the known world. He declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first sovereign emperor, and set about remaking his new empire in the image of his own ruthless philosophy. His first acts were those of a visionary tyrant, to break down the old feudal loyalties and the regional identities that had fueled centuries of war. He standardized everything. He created a single currency, a single system of weights and measures, a single unified legal code, and even standardized the width of axles on carts so that all roads throughout the empire would be uniform. But this quest for absolute order was enforced with diabolical cruelty. The punishments for deviating from his new standards were draconian. A merchant caught using the old currency, a scholar using an old character in his writing. These were not minor infractions. They were acts of treason against the new order, often punishable by forced labor, brutal mutilation, or death. His grandest creation, a monument to both his power and his paranoia, was the Great Wall. He connected and massively expanded the existing border fortifications of the northern states to create a single, unified defense against the nomadic Xiongnu tribes. It was a project of staggering scale and ambition, a river of stone and earth that snaked across the mountains and deserts. To build it, he conscripted a vast army of laborers numbering in the hundreds of thousands, soldiers, convicts, and peasants torn from their farms. The conditions were inhuman. Men toiled in the brutal heat of summer and the freezing cold of winter, given only starvation-level rations of grain. The death toll from exhaustion, starvation, and accidents was immense, so high that the wall became known for centuries as the Hat, longest cemetery on Earth. Legend holds that the bodies of the countless dead workers were not even given proper burials, but were simply thrown into the foundation and buried within the structure of the wall itself. The emperor was building his monument to order with a mortar mixed of earth, stone, and human bones. Having forged a nation from earth and bone, Qin Shi Huang now turned his attention to a more insidious enemy, the minds of his own people. His diabolical quest for absolute control was not just about standardizing roads and currency, it was about standardizing thought. His next unthinkable creation would not be a wall of stone, but a firewall against history, memory, and ideas themselves. And this path is in a bad bat. Having unified the warring states and consolidated his physical control over the land with projects like the Great War, the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, turned his diabolical attention to a more subtle and, in his mind, more dangerous enemy: the past. His brilliant and utterly ruthless legalist chancellor, Li Si, came to him with a stark warning. The greatest threat to the emperor's absolute power, he argued, was not a foreign army, but the minds of his own scholars. These intellectuals, particularly the followers of Confucius, were constantly using the past to criticize the present. They would tell tales of the benevolent golden age of past dynasties to implicitly condemn the emperor's new, harsh, and centralized laws. The memory of a different world, Li Si argued, was a seed of rebellion. The solution was as simple as it was terrifying. They had to erase it. In 213 BC, Qin Shi Huang issued one of the most infamous decrees in the history of civilization. He ordered the burning of the books. All historical records from the old kingdoms were to be confiscated and burned. All works of philosophy, poetry, and political discourse, the rich tapestry of thought known as the 100 schools of thought that had blossomed during the Warring States period, were to be utterly destroyed. The only books permitted to exist were practical, state-sanctioned manuals on medicine, agriculture, and divination. It was a state-sanctioned act of cultural genocide, a diabolical attempt to sever his empire from all that had come before it, so that he alone could be the source of all knowledge and all history. Imperial officials went from house to house, from library to library, confiscating the priceless bamboo and silk scrolls that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries. In the great city squares, massive bonfires were lit, and the intellectual heritage of a civilization was turned to ash. But even this was not enough. Some scholars, in a brave act of intellectual defiance, hid their books or continued to speak out against the emperor's tyranny. For this crime of independent thought, Qin Shi Huang devised his most intimate and diabolical creation of cruelty. In 212 BC, he had 460 of these dissenting Confucian scholars arrested. He had a massive pit dug near the capital city of Xianyang. He then had all 460 of them thrown in and buried alive. The emperor forced his own eldest son and heir, Fu Su, to witness the horrifying spectacle. Fu Su, who had been educated by Confucian tutors, was appalled by the brutality and had the courage to protest his father's actions. But the emperor's diabolical vision had no room for compassion. For the crime of empathy, he had his own son stripped of his titles and exiled to the remote northern frontier to supervise the construction of the Great War, a virtual death sentence. The emperor's war on the past had now become a war on his own future. As he aged, the man who had conquered all his enemies became pathologically terrified of the one enemy he could not defeat: his own mortality. His fear of assassination became so intense that he built a network of secret, walled tunnels and overhead passages connecting his 270 palaces, so that no one in the entire empire would ever know for sure where he was sleeping on any given night. He became obsessed with finding the elixir of life. He sent his court alchemists and mystics on vast expeditions to find a fabled island of immortals located somewhere in the eastern seas. One such expedition, led by an alchemist named Xu Fu, consisted of a massive fleet carrying thousands of young men and women. They set sail in search of eternal life for the emperor and were never seen again. This desperate and paranoid hunt for immortality led to his final and most magnificent creation, his own tomb. For nearly 4 decades, over 700,000 conscripted laborers, more than were used to build the Great Wall, toiled in secret to build a subterranean city for his afterlife. The tomb complex was the ultimate paranoid fortress. The ancient historian Sima Qian, writing less than a century after the emperor's death, described a vast underground palace containing a scale model of the entire empire. The ceiling was studded with pearls to mimic the sun, moon, and stars. The floor was a map of his kingdom, with rivers and seas made of flowing liquid mercury, which was toxic to the touch. And the entire complex, he wrote, was protected by a series of automated crossbows, set to fire on any intruder who dared to disturb the emperor's eternal slumber. And to guard him in this afterlife, to be his personal army against the vengeful spirits of the kingdoms he had conquered, he built the Terracotta Army. In a series of vast pits surrounding the tomb mound, he buried over 8,000 life-sized clay soldiers. There were infantrymen, archers, cavalry, and generals, along with hundreds of horses and war chariots. Each soldier was crafted with a unique, individual face, a silent, eternal army waiting for his command. But even this masterpiece of art and ego was completed with one last, truly diabolical act of cruelty. Marx died in the palace and Broke left, to ensure the secrets of his tomb's location and its treasures were kept forever. Sima Qian records that all of the artisans, craftsmen, craft with combos of these problems with Constantines and knots. His dynasty, which he had intended to last for 10,000 generations, collapsed in a firestorm of rebellion just 3 years after his death. He remains one of the most consequential and controversial figures in human history. He was the visionary who forged the nation of China, but he was also a diabolical tyrant whose philosophy viewed human beings as nothing more than raw materials to be used, controlled, or discarded in the service of the state. His magnificent creations, the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army, are wonders of the world, but they are also silent monuments to a ruler whose diabolical vision was built on a foundation of crushed dissent, erased history, and the bones of the millions who died to make it a reality. On April 17th, 1975, the city of Phnom Penh, the beautiful, war-weary capital of Cambodia, erupted in celebration. The brutal, 5-year-long civil war was finally over. The victorious Khmer Rouge Army, a disciplined and mysterious force of young, black-clad soldiers, marched into the city. The people, exhausted and starving, but desperate for peace, flooded the streets to welcome them as liberators, waving white flags and offering them water and food. The young soldiers smiled, accepted the offerings, and for a few brief, hopeful hours, it seemed as though Cambodia's long nightmare was at an end. But then, the smiles vanished. The soldiers began to fire their guns into the air, their faces turning to stone. A new order, cold and absolute, was barked through megaphones, echoing through the streets. Everyone must leave the city, immediately. The Americans are going to bomb the city. The soldiers shouted, a lie repeated over and over. You only need to be gone for 3 days to be purified. The anchor will take care of everything. It was the first and most diabolical lie of a new regime. This was day 1 of year 0. The city was being emptied, not to save its people, but to destroy a way of life. This was the first act in the master plan of a quiet, enigmatic, and terrifyingly patient man named Salif Sar, a former school teacher who the world would come to know by a far more infamous name, Pol Pot. He was about to turn his entire nation into a vast open-air concentration camp, and in his obsessive, fanatical quest to create a perfect agricultural utopia, he would orchestrate one of the most savage and absolute genocides in all of human history. The man who would become Brother Number One was a ghost, a figure of profound and deliberate mystery. He was not a ranting demagogue or a charismatic, theatrical tyrant. He was soft-spoken, secretive, and had an unnervingly gentle, almost grandfatherly smile. Born into a relatively prosperous farming family, he had the rare opportunity to travel to Paris in the 1950s to study radio electronics. It was there, in the radical student circles of the left bank, that he became obsessed with a pure, extreme, and deeply dogmatic form of Marxist-Leninist ideology. He read the great communist thinkers, but he took from them a twisted and romanticized vision. He returned to Cambodia with a diabolical idea taking shape in his mind. He believed that all of society's evils, inequality, corruption, exploitation, were the product of cities. He saw cities as parasites, breeding grounds for corrupting Western influences, intellectualism, and commerce. He believed the family unit was a nest of spies that encouraged selfish individualism over loyalty to the state. Money, modern medicine, formal education, religion, all of it was a cancer that had to be brutally excised. His dream was to create a perfect, classless, agrarian society, a nation purified of all foreign influence, where everyone would be a simple, hard-working, and completely equal peasant toiling in the rice paddies. But to achieve this utopia, to build this new world, he first had to completely erase the old one. He had to reset the clock of his nation to year zero. When his Khmer Rouge forces finally conquered Cambodia in 1975, he put his diabolical plan into immediate and brutal effect. The forced evacuation of Phnom Penh and every other city and town in the country was the first step. More than 2 million people were driven out of their homes at gunpoint. There were no exceptions. Patients were forced from their hospital beds, some still with intravenous strips in their arms. Women were forced to march while in the middle of giving birth. The old, the sick, and the very young who could not keep up with the relentless pace of the march were simply shot or left on the side of the road to die. It was a death march on a national scale, a brutal and chaotic exodus that killed tens of thousands in the first few weeks alone. The survivors of this march were now stripped of their identities. They were the new people, the corrupted city dwellers who had to be re-educated. They were marched into the countryside and forced to work as slaves in vast, primitive agricultural communes. Their old lives were gone. Their homes, their possessions, their money, all of it was declared property of the state, which was referred to only as the few, Anka, a Khmer word meaning simply the organization. The Anka was presented as an all-powerful, all-knowing, and completely anonymous entity. It was, in reality, the sole circle of the Khmer Rouge leadership, with Pol Pot as its undisputed, invisible master. Life in these communes was a living hell, a meticulously designed system of dehumanization. The workday was 12 hours or more of grueling physical labor in the rice paddies, often with only primitive handmade tools. The reward was a starvation-level ration of watery rice soup, a thin gruel that left the entire population in a state of chronic malnutrition. The family, which Pol Pot saw as a reactionary institution, was systematically destroyed. Children were separated from their parents and put into their own labor brigades. They were taught that the Angkar was their only true parent and were encouraged to inform on their own mothers and fathers for any sign of disloyalty or for hoarding food. The ultimate goal of the Angkar was purification, and purification meant the systematic extermination of anyone and everyone connected to the old world. This was not a random series of killings. It was a diabolical and carefully implemented policy. The first to be eliminated were the soldiers and high-ranking officials of the former government. But the purge soon expanded to encompass anyone deemed a class enemy or an intellectual. The definition of an intellectual was terrifyingly and absurdly broad. Having a formal education was a death sentence. Doctors, teachers, lawyers, engineers, and scientists were all hunted down and killed. Speaking a foreign language was a death sentence. Even wearing glasses, a sign that you were a reader, could get you killed. Monks were disrobed and forced into the hardest labor, and thousands of ancient Buddhist temples were desecrated as the regime tried to eradicate religion itself. The Khmer Rouge were not just killing people, they were trying to murder a culture. They were attempting to wipe the collective memory of a nation clean. Having successfully transformed Cambodia into a nationwide prison camp and erased its past, the Angkar now turned its diabolical attention from enslavement to a more focused and paranoid form of purification. The time for simple re-education through labor was over. The time for extermination was about to begin. Having successfully plunged his country into a pre-industrial nightmare, Pol Pot and the mysterious ruling body known as the Angkar became consumed by new, more paranoid phase of their diabolical plan. Their revolution, they believed, was still not pure. It was being threatened from within, infested with spies, traitors, and class enemies who were secretly working to sabotage their agrarian utopia. A massive, nationwide purge was launched to identify and eliminate these hidden threats. The Khmer Rouge, which had already exterminated the educated and urban classes, now began to turn on itself. At the heart of this paranoid new system of extermination was Pol Pot's most infamous and unthinkable creation, the Tuol Sleng prison, a secret facility in the heart of the now empty capital of Phnom Penh, known by its codename S-21. This former high school was transformed into the Khmer Rouge's main interrogation and torture center. It was a place where the regime's deepest paranoia was given free and bureaucratic reign. The prisoners sent to Sephiroth, 21. They were not common criminals. They were, for the most part, loyal Khmer Rouge members and their families who had fallen under the suspicion of the Angkar. A cadre, a factory worker, or a soldier who made a small mistake or was simply denounced by a rival would be arrested in the dead of night and brought here. Once a person entered the gates of S-21, their life was already over. The only question was how long it would take for them to die. The bureaucracy of S-21 was chillingly meticulous, a diabolical fusion of record-keeping and sadism. Each new prisoner was photographed, their faces often showing a mixture of confusion, defiance, and stark terror. These thousands of haunting black and white portraits would later become one of the world's most gut-wrenching museum exhibits. After being photographed, the prisoners were forced to write out detailed autobiographies. Then, the interrogations would begin. The sole purpose of the torture at S-21 was not to extract the truth, but to create a false one. The goal was to force the prisoner to validate the regime's paranoia by confessing to being a spy for the CIA, the KGB, or the Vietnamese. The torture methods were varied, systematic, and horrific. Prisoners were subjected to severe beatings, electrocution, waterboarding, and had their fingernails pulled out. After weeks or months of this agony, the broken prisoners would finally produce the elaborate, fictional confessions demanded of them, often implicating their own friends, family members, and comrades in their imaginary spy rings. These newly named traitors would then be arrested and brought into the same meat grinder. It was a self-perpetuating machine of paranoia and death. Of the estimated 17,000 people who were imprisoned at S-21 over the course of 4 years, men, women, and children, only a handful Less than a dozen are known to have survived. Once the confessions were extracted and meticulously filed away, the prisoners were deemed ready for the final stage of purification. They were told they were being transferred to a new house. They were loaded onto trucks and driven a few miles outside the city to a series of quiet orchards that would become known to the world by a simple, horrifying name: the killing fields. To save precious and expensive bullets, the executions were carried out with the crudest of instruments. The prisoners were forced to kneel at the edge of vast, pre-dug mass graves. The teenage Khmer Rouge guards, often desensitized by years of violence, would then kill them with blows to the back of the head from iron bars, axe handles, shovels, or sharpened bamboo sticks. The most horrific fate of all was reserved for the infants and children of the accused. The Khmer Rouge had a chillingly pragmatic motto: to spare the grass, one must also remove the roots. The children were killed, often by being swung by their legs and having their heads smashed against a tree, so that they could never grow up to seek revenge for their murdered parents. For 3 years, 8 months and 20 days, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge presided over this self-inflicted genocide. They systematically murdered their own nation in the name of a twisted, agrarian dream. The country's infrastructure completely collapsed. Famine and preventable diseases were rampant. It is estimated that by the time the regime fell, nearly 2 million Cambodians, a quarter of the country's entire population, were dead. Pol Pot's diabolical reign was finally brought to an end in 1979, not by a popular uprising. The population was too starved, exhausted, and terrorized for that, but by an invasion from their former communist allies, Vietnam. Pol Pot and the remnants of the Khmer Rouge escaped to the jungle, where, with the tacit support of some world powers who saw them as a useful counterweight to the Vietnamese, they waged a guerrilla war for years. He was never brought to a formal international trial for his crimes against humanity. He died in 1998, a free man, in a small jungle hut, while under house arrest by his own former comrades. The diabolical nature of Pol Pot was that of a quiet, patient, and utterly convinced ideologue. His unthinkable creation was not a single torture device or a momentary act of cruelty, but an entire country turned into a concentration camp. He was a man who murdered millions of his own people, not in a fit of rage or for personal wealth, but as a necessary and logical step in his twisted philosophical quest to create a perfect world. His reign is a terrifying reminder that the most diabolical evil is often not the one that screams and rages, but the one that smiles softly, speaks of utopia, and calmly signs the death warrants for a nation. He was a man who banned adultery, theft, and kidnapping, punishing them all with death. He created a written language for his people where none had existed before. He established a continental postal service, the Yam, so efficient that messengers could travel over 200 miles in a single day. And in his vast conquered lands, he declared universal religious freedom for all who submitted to his rule. By this description, he sounds like one of history's great lawgivers, a visionary unifier of men. But this same man, in his quest to conquer the world, would be responsible for the deaths of an estimated 40 million people, a staggering 10% of the world's entire population at the time. This is the diabolical paradox of Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan. He was a brilliant nation builder for his own people, and a force of almost apocalyptic destruction for everyone else. He was a diabolical genius who built the largest contiguous land empire in human history on a foundation of discipline, innovation, and mountains of human skulls. His own life was forged in a crucible of brutal hardship on the unforgiving Mongolian steppe. He was born into a minor noble family But his world shattered at the age of 9, when his father, a minor chieftain, was poisoned by a rival tribe, the Tartars. His own clan, seeing no use for a widowed mother and her young children, abandoned them. Temujin and his family were cast out, left to starve in the wilderness. They survived by eating roots, rodents, and whatever they could forage. It was here that he learned his first and most important lesson. The world is a merciless place where loyalty is fleeting, and only the strong and the utterly ruthless survive. His early life was a relentless series of betrayals and brutal struggles. He was captured and enslaved by a rival clan, forced to wear a heavy wooden collar, a kange, around his neck. But even as a teenager, his iron will was apparent. He staged a daring nighttime escape, a feat that began to build his reputation. As a young man, his new wife, Berthe, was kidnapped by another tribe. Temujin, consumed with rage, did not give up. He spent months forging alliances, raising a small army, and finally launching a bloody raid to rescue her. He slaughtered his enemies and took his wife back. This event solidified the second great lesson of his life. What is yours, you hold with a grip of iron, and what is taken from you, you take back with fire and sword. Slowly, painstakingly, through a combination of brilliant diplomacy, strategic alliances, and breathtakingly brutal warfare, he began his great project, the unification of the scattered, constantly warring Mongol tribes. He was a revolutionary innovator. He shattered the old, unstable tribal aristocracy, where leadership was based on noble bloodlines. In his place, he created a strict meritocracy. He promoted his generals based on proven skill, and above all, absolute loyalty to him, regardless of their birth. The old tribal divisions were erased, and all men were now simply Mongols, united under his singular command. His justice was as swift as it was brutal. After finally defeating the Tatar tribe, the ones who had poisoned his father decades earlier, he enacted a diabolical and chillingly systematic revenge. He ordered that every single Tatar male taller than the linchpin of a cartwheel be brought before him and executed. It was an act of near-hyphen genocide, a cold and calculated extermination of an entire generation of his old enemies. By 1206, his work was complete. He summoned a great council, a cruelty, of all the tribes of Mongolia. There, on the banks of the Onon River, they declared him the supreme and universal ruler of all the Mongol peoples, bestowing upon him the title he would carry into history, Genghis Khan. He established his power with the Yasa, his secret legal code. The first law of the Yasa was the demand for absolute, unquestioning obedience to the Khan. The penalty for disloyalty was death. The penalty for cowardice was death. The penalty for theft was death. He had forged the scattered, feuding horsemen of the steppe into a single, disciplined, and terrifyingly effective war machine, all bound to his will. Having united the world he knew, Genghis Khan now turned his gaze outward, to the great, wealthy, and seemingly invincible empires to the south and west. His first target was the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast and powerful sultanate that stretched across modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. He initially sought not conquest, but trade. He sent a massive caravan of 500 merchants to the Khwarezmian city of Otrar, but the city's governor, suspecting them of being spies, had the entire caravan arrested and executed, seizing their goods. Genghis Khan, in a show of restraint, sent 3 more envoys directly to the Shah of the empire, demanding the governor be punished. The Shah, in an act of supreme arrogance, had one of the envoys executed and sent the other 2 back with their beards shaved off, a sign of ultimate humiliation. The Shah had just made the single greatest mistake of his life. He had insulted the Khan and he had murdered his representatives. The response would be a storm of vengeance, so diabolical, it would change the course of world history and leave a trail of ruined cities and desolate wastelands in its wake. The full, terrifying might of the Mongol war machine was about to be unleashed upon the civilized world. The insult from the Khwarezmian Shah was the spark that ignited a world-consuming fire. In the year 1219, Genghis Khan unleashed his Mongol horde, an army of over 100,000 mounted archers, upon the Khwarezmian Empire. This was not just a war, it was a punitive expedition, an act of vengeance on a continental scale. And it was here that Genghis Khan would perfect his most diabolical and effective tool of conquest, the systematic use of absolute terror. His strategy was as simple as it was brutal. He made a clear and unambiguous offer to every city and fortress that lay in his path. Surrender unconditionally and accept Mongol rule, and your lives will be spared. Resist, fight back, or show any form of defiance, and your entire population will be exterminated. It was a calculated policy of psychological warfare, designed to make resistance seem so horrifyingly futile that cities would simply capitulate out of sheer, paralyzing fear. The first city to feel the full weight of his wrath was Otrar, the place where his merchants had been killed. After a 5-month siege, the city fell. The governor, who had murdered the caravan, was captured alive. According to some accounts, Genghis Khan had molten silver poured into his eyes and ears as a punishment for his greed. The rest of the city's population was systematically massacred. From there, the Mongol storm swept across Central Asia, leaving a trail of almost unimaginable devastation. They descended upon the great cities of the Silk Road, centers of learning, culture, and commerce that had stood for centuries. The city of Bukhara, a jewel of the Islamic world, was captured. Genghis Khan rode his horse into the city's great mosque, a sacrilegious act of supreme dominance. He had the city's wealthy citizens rounded up and then gave a chilling speech, telling them that he was the duchy, punishment of God, sent to them because of their sins. He then turned the city over to his soldiers, who plundered it, burned its great library to the ground, and slaughtered thousands. Next came Samarkand, one of the most magnificent cities in the world. After a brief siege, the city surrendered. Genghis Khan had the entire population marched out onto a plain. He had the city's artisans and skilled craftsmen, the engineers, the weavers, the metalworkers, separated and sent back to Mongolia as slaves to serve his empire. The remaining several 100,000 men, women, and children were systematically killed, each of his soldiers given a quota of executions to fulfill. He then had the city's complex and ancient irrigation canals, the very source of its life, completely destroyed, deliberately turning the lush, fertile oasis into a barren wasteland. This was not just a massacre. It was an act of diabolical ecological warfare, an attempt to erase a civilization from the map. In city after city, the pattern was repeated. Nishapur, Nerv, Arat. The accounts from Persian chroniclers of the time are a litany of horror. At Nishapur, after his son-in-law was killed in the fighting, Genghis Khan's daughter reportedly requested that every living thing in the city be killed. The Mongol soldiers carried out the order, slaughtering not just the entire human population, but the city's dogs and cats as well. Afterwards, to ensure no one had survived by hiding, they beheaded the corpses and built gruesome, towering pyramids from their severed heads. The scale of this diabolical slaughter is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. It was not a series of battles, it was a demographic catastrophe. Historians estimate that the population of the region of modern-day Iran may have dropped by as much as 75%, from 2.5 million people to just 250,000. Millions were killed. Great cities that had been centers of world culture for centuries were reduced to smoldering ruins. Their libraries turned to ash, their gardens to desert. Genghis Khan himself was the cold, calculating mind at the center of this storm. This was not the chaotic violence of a madman. It was the deliberate, pragmatic, and terrifyingly logical application of a military strategy. By making an example of the first few cities that resisted, he ensured that countless others would surrender without a fight, saving Mongol lives and speeding the pace of his conquest. Terror was simply his most efficient weapon. He was a master of siege warfare, using captured engineers to build sophisticated siege engines. He was a master of psychological warfare, using terror and propaganda to break the will of his enemies before a single arrow was fired. And he was a master of discipline, holding his own soldiers to the same brutal standard. A Mongol warrior who looted before the official signal was given was put to death. His army was a perfectly honed instrument of his own iron will. Genghis Khan died in 1227, while on a campaign to punish another kingdom that had defied him. He had conquered more territory than any single person in history, creating an empire that would stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. But for his own people, the Mongols, he was a revered founding father, a unifier who gave them a name, a law, and a purpose. Under his rule, the Silk Road was pacified, and a new era of trade and cultural exchange between East and West, the Pax Mongolica, began. But to the rest of the world, he was the scourge of God. His diabolical genius was in his cold, pragmatic use of mass terror and slaughter as a deliberate instrument of state policy. His unthinkable creation was not a single torture device, but a war machine so efficient and so utterly ruthless that it held the entire known world in a state of mortal fear. He was a man who, having clawed his way out of a brutal and unforgiving childhood, went on to remake the world in his own image, forever changing the balance of power between East and West in a great and terrible tide of blood. In the grand palaces of Brussels, he was King Leopold II of Belgium, a constitutional monarch, a respected statesman on a world stage, and a great philanthropist who graced his capital with magnificent parks, grand avenues, and opulent museums, earning him the title of the Lamma, Builder King. In the great halls of European diplomacy, he was a visionary humanitarian, a man who spoke with passionate conviction about the moral duty of Europeans to end the horrific Arab slave trade in Central Africa and to bring the benevolent light of civilization, Christianity, and free trade to its darkest corners. But on the ground, in the sweltering rubber-choked rainforests of the Congo River Basin, he was known by other names. He was a diabolical tyrant, an unseen phantom king, the absolute and sole owner of a private slave state the size of Western Europe. He was a man whose insatiable pathological greed would unleash a holocaust of terror, torture, and mutilation upon millions of innocent people. This is the story of the Congo Free State, the personal property of King Leopold, and one of the most depraved and diabolical creations in all of human history. Leopold II was a man consumed by a deep and gnawing ambition. He was the king of a small, relatively new, and constitutionally limited European country. He looked with envy at the vast colonial empires of his relatives, like Queen Victoria of Great Britain. He believed that for a nation, and for a king to be truly great, it needed colonies, a place on the map, painted in its color, a source of raw materials, national prestige, and, most importantly, immense personal wealth. He once lamented, "There are no small countries, only small minds." But the Belgian government and its people had no interest in the expensive and difficult business of colonialism. So, Leopold decided he would have to do it himself. Africa, the so-called Made Dark Continent, was the final frontier for European colonial ambition. Leopold set his sights on the vast, largely unexplored Congo River Basin, a territory of nearly 1 million square miles, rich in resources, but he could not simply conquer it. So he embarked on a brilliant, cynical, and diabolical campaign of public relations. In 1876, he convened a grand geographical conference in Brussels, inviting the most famous explorers and humanitarians from across the world. He stood before them and gave a series of magnificent, soaring speeches. He spoke of his dream to establish a series of benevolent stations along the Congo River, to bring peace, to stamp out the slave trade, and to bring the sacred cause of humanity to the people of Central Africa. He created a front organization with a noble-sounding name, the International African Association. It was, he claimed, a multinational, philanthropic endeavor. This was a complete and utter lie. It was a shell company, designed from the start to be the vehicle for his own personal, colonial ambitions. His man on the ground was the famous and famously ruthless Welsh-American explorer, Henry Morton Stanley. Leopold hired Stanley to travel deep into the Congo, not just to map the river, but to claim the land. For 5 years, Stanley traveled through the jungle, using a combination of modern technology, intimidation, and outright fraud. He would impress the local Congolese chiefs with his electric buzzers and repeating rifles, and then have them sign treaties they could not possibly understand. In exchange for a few bolts of cloth or bottles of gin, these chiefs unknowingly signed away their lands, their resources, and the lives of their people, granting Leopold's organization a complete monopoly over their territory. Armed with these hundreds of Shan treaties, Leopold made his final move on the world stage. At the Great Berlin Conference of 1884, where the European powers gathered to carve up Africa amongst themselves, Leopold masterfully played the great nations against each other. He convinced the United States that his Congo Free State would be a free trade zone, a benevolent enterprise that would benefit all nations. He promised the British he would help them counter French and Portuguese ambitions in the region. He promised the French he would support them against the British. He lied to everyone, and it worked. In an act of staggering diplomatic blindness, the great powers of the world officially recognized King Leopold II of Belgium not as the head of a Belgian colony, but as the personal sovereign ruler of the Congo Free State. He was now the sole private owner of a territory 76 times the size of Belgium, along with its estimated 20 million people. At first, the primary source of plunder was ivory, but in the 1890s, a global invention changed everything. The development of the pneumatic tire for bicycles and the new automobile industry created a sudden and massive, almost insatiable demand for rubber, and Leopold's personal jungle was filled with wild rubber vines. He had been gifted a literal gold mine. To exploit it, he created his own private army, the Force Publique. Its officers were white Europeans, a motley collection of mercenaries, adventurers, and military men from across the continent, chosen not for their discipline, but for their ruthlessness. Its enlisted soldiers were Africans, many of them kidnapped from their villages as children, or recruited from notoriously fierce and sometimes cannibalistic tribes. They were brutalized, trained, and turned into merciless enforcers, a tool of terror to be wielded against their own people. With the price of rubber skyrocketing on the world market, Leopold's agents in the Congo instituted a diabolical system of pure terror to maximize production at any cost. Every village was given an impossibly high quota of raw rubber that its men were required to collect. But the currency of this new system was not money. It was fear. And the proof that this fear was being properly enforced, the token that the soldiers had to present to their white officers, was a gruesome and unforgettable one. The severed hands of men, women, and children. With the price of rubber skyrocketing on the world market, King Leopold's agents in his private Congo Free State instituted a diabolical system of terror to extract the maximum amount of profit. Every village was given an impossibly high quota of raw rubber that its men were required to collect from the deep, dangerous jungle. The currency of this new system was not money, it was fear. And the proof that this fear was being properly enforced was a gruesome and unforgettable token: the severed hands of men, women, and children. The twisted logic behind this policy of mutilation was a matter of brutal corporate accounting. The European offices of the Force Publique issued their African soldiers modern rifles and a strict number of cartridges. To ensure that the soldiers were not wasting these expensive bullets on hunting for food, or, worse, on plotting a mutiny, they were required to provide proof for every single bullet fired. The proof they were ordered to bring back was the severed right hand of a person they had killed. This grotesque policy quickly devolved into a nightmarish economy of its own. Soldiers, wanting to save their ammunition for hunting, to supplement their meager rations, found it was easier to simply attack defenseless villages and cut off their hands, leaving them to bleed to death, rather than wasting a bullet. Hands became a form of currency. Baskets of smoked human hands were presented to the white officers at the collection posts as proof of their brutal work. Villages that failed to meet their impossible rubber quotas were often raided by the Force Publique, who would massacre the inhabitants and chop off their hands. In some horrifying cases, soldiers would demand tribute from a village not in rubber, but in a certain number of hands, forcing the villagers to either kill their neighbors or face the consequences. The terror was absolute. The primary tool of punishment, besides outright murder, was the shakot, a brutal whip made of raw, sun-dried hippopotamus hide with sharp, razor-like edges. A sentence of 100 lashes with the shakot was, for many, a death sentence. To ensure the rubber quotas were met, the Force Publique would often raid a village and take all the women and children hostage. They would be held in squalid, open-air stockades, where they were starved and abused. Their husbands and fathers were then told that their families would only be released once the village's rubber quota was fulfilled. Many of these hostages did not survive. For years, this state-sponsored nightmare continued in the depths of the jungle, hidden from the world by Leopold's carefully crafted humanitarian facade. But the truth, in all its horror, eventually began to leak out. The first cracks in the wall of silence came from a handful of courageous whistleblowers. An African-American journalist and historian named George Washington Williams traveled to the Congo and was so horrified by what he saw that he wrote a scathing open letter to King Leopold in 1890, detailing the abuses and calling his state eternal soul. Oh, this prince, living hell. But it was a British shipping clerk in Liverpool named E.D. Morel who would become the architect of Leopold's downfall. Morel's job was to track the cargo going in and out of the Congo. He noticed a strange and sinister discrepancy. The ships arriving in Belgium from the Congo were filled with a fortune in valuable resources, rubber and ivory, but the ships going to the Congo were filled almost exclusively with soldiers, guns, and ammunition. There were no commercial goods being traded. Morel, a man of great moral clarity, deduced the horrifying truth. This was not free trade. This was slavery. The people of the Congo were not being paid. They were being conquered. Morel quit his job and became a full-time investigative journalist and humanitarian activist. He founded the Congo Reform Association, and alongside other humanitarians, like the British diplomat Roger Casement, whose official and deeply disturbing Casement report confirmed the atrocities. He launched one of the first great international human rights campaigns in history, but their most powerful weapon was a new and undeniable form of evidence: the photograph. A British missionary named Alice Seeley Harris had begun to use a camera to document the horrors she witnessed. Her photographs were not tales or rumors. They were irrefutable proof. Her most famous and soul-crushing image shows a Congolese man named Nesala of Wala sitting on a porch. He is not looking at the camera. He is staring at a small, severed hand and a foot laid before him. They were the remains of his 5-year-old daughter, who had been killed and dismembered by the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company's militia as a punishment because his village had failed to meet its rubber quota. This single, devastating photograph, when published in newspapers across the world, brought the distant horror of the Congo directly into the living rooms of Europe and America. The international public outcry, fueled by Morel's campaign, Casement's report, and Harris's photographs, became a tidal wave of condemnation. Prominent figures like Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle wrote scathing indictments of Leopold. The pressure became too much. In 1908, the Gospel, Bilder King, the great humanitarian, was finally forced to relinquish his personal control of the Congo to the Belgian state. But before he handed over the keys to his kingdom of death, he committed one final, diabolical act. He ordered the complete destruction of the entire archives of his Congo Free State. For 8 straight days and nights, the furnaces in his Brussels office burned as he systematically incinerated the vast majority of the official records of his brutal regime. A final, cynical attempt to erase the memory of his millions of victims from the pages of history. King Leopold II of Belgium was directly responsible for a genocide that led to the deaths of an estimated 10 million Congolese people, a number that rivals the worst atrocities of the 20th century. He was never punished. He was never put on trial. He died peacefully in his palace in 1909, one of the richest men in the world. His vast fortune and the grand avenues of Brussels, funded by the red rubber, harvested by his slaves. His diabolical creation was a new and terrifying kind of modern evil, a cold, bureaucratic, and corporate form of mass murder, all hidden behind the respectable mask of humanitarian progress. His story is the ultimate proof that some of history's most monstrous rulers don't need to wield a sword or command an army on the battlefield. They only need a pen, a ledger, and a complete and utter absence of the human soul. The Great Plaza is filled with a silent, terrified crowd, held back by stern-faced soldiers. At the center, on a massive raised platform draped in royal banners, sit the King and Queen of Spain, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Before them, a grim and humiliating procession begins. A line of condemned heretics, their heads shaved, their feet bare, are paraded onto the stage. They are dressed in yellow sackcloth robes called the San Benito, each one painstakingly painted with images of demons, dragons, and the flames of hell. Their crimes are read aloud to the assembled masses: secretly practicing Judaism, possessing a forbidden book, failing to eat pork, or questioning the authority of the Holy Church. Their sentences are then pronounced. Some will be publicly whipped, others condemned to a lifetime of imprisonment in a dark dungeon. But for those who have refused to confess their sins, the unrepentant, the sentence is the most dreaded of all. They will be relaxed to the secular authorities, a chilling euphemism for being taken to the edge of the city and burned alive at the stake. This is the auto da fe, the act of faith, the diabolical centerpiece and public relations spectacle of the most feared institution in all of Christendom, the Spanish Inquisition. And the two monarchs watching from their throne were its architects. To understand the diabolical creation of Isabella and Ferdinand, you must first understand the world that created them. For nearly 800 years, the Iberian Peninsula had been a battleground. The Christian kingdoms of the north had been locked in a slow, brutal, and near-constant holy war to reconquer the lands of Spain for the Muslim Moorish caliphates of the south. This was the Reconquista, and it forged a deeply militaristic and fanatically religious society, a culture where national identity and Catholic identity were one and the same. Into this world came the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469. Their union brought together the two largest Christian kingdoms, effectively creating the political entity of Spain. They were a brilliant and effective royal partnership. They centralized power, reformed the government and military, and in 1492 they would complete the Reconquista by conquering the last Muslim stronghold of Granada. But their obsession was not just with political unity, it was with absolute religious unity. For centuries, Spain had been a place of relative tolerance, a culture of convivencia, or coexistence, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims had lived side by side, creating one of the most vibrant intellectual and cultural centers in the world. But to Isabella and Ferdinand, this diversity was not a strength, it was a poison. They believed that for Spain to be a truly great and unified nation, it had to be a purely, universally Catholic nation. The large, successful, and long-established Jewish and Muslim populations were, in their eyes, an intolerable stain on the soul of their kingdom. Their primary concern was the problem of the conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under immense pressure and the threat of violence. A deep-seated and paranoid suspicion festered among the old Christians that these converts were not sincere, that they were secretly practicing their old faith in the privacy of their own homes. They were accused of being crookly Jews and a fifth column of heretics pretending to be Christian while secretly working to undermine the church from within. This paranoia was fanned into a flame by Isabella's personal confessor, a stern and fanatical Dominican friar named Tomás de Torquemada. Torquemada was a man obsessed with the idea of religious purity, and he relentlessly preached to the Queen that a holy war against heresy was not just a political necessity, but a divine command from God. He convinced her that only through a new, powerful, and utterly ruthless inquisition could the kingdom be purified of its hidden enemies. He tried to save the faithful mother. In 1478, Isabella and Ferdinand petitioned the Pope and were granted the right to establish their own inquisition. And this is the key to its diabolical power. Unlike the earlier papal inquisition, which was controlled by the Church in Rome, the Spanish Inquisition was to be an instrument of the Spanish crown. The monarchs would appoint the Inquisitor General, and the institution would answer to them. It was a perfect and terrifying fusion of a state security apparatus and a religious tribunal. It was a secret police force that could hunt for heretics and a holy court that could condemn souls, all in the name of the king and queen. With Tomás de Torquemada appointed as the first Grand Inquisitor, this new institution began to spread its tentacles across the Kingdom of Castile, and later, all of Spain. Tens of houses. So far, the diabolical genius of the Inquisition was how it turned Spanish society against itself. An edict of grace would be proclaimed in a new town, giving heretics a few weeks to turn themselves in and confess their sins in exchange for a lighter penance. But the edict also commanded all citizens, under threat of their own excommunication, to become informers. Neighbors were ordered to spy on neighbors. They were instructed to watch for suspicious signs. A family that wore fine clothes on a Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath. A household that did not cook with pork fat, or the sound of prayers being whispered in Hebrew or Arabic. A climate of suffocating fear and suspicion descended upon the land. A personal grudge, a business rivalry, or a simple rumor was enough to lead to an anonymous denunciation. Once a person was accused, the inexorable and terrifying machinery of the Inquisition would grind into motion. The hunt for souls had begun, and the price of being found wanting was the stake. With the fanatical Tomás de Torquemada as the first Grand Inquisitor, the Spanish Inquisition, the diabolical creation of Isabella and Ferdinand, began its grim work. Its methods were a masterpiece of psychological terror and bureaucratic cruelty. When a person was denounced to the Holy Office, the process would begin. The arrest was almost always a surprise, a pre-dawn raid by armed lay servants of the Inquisition, the familiares. The accused would be taken away in secret, often to a sound-proofed dungeon, their property immediately and systematically confiscated to fund the very institution that was about to destroy them. Their families would often have no idea where they had gone, or what crime they had been accused of. Once imprisoned, the accused entered a surreal and terrifying legal world. The Inquisition's guiding principle was that there is no smoke without fire. Guilt was already assumed. The goal of the interrogation was not to determine if a crime had been committed, but to secure a full, detailed confession of heresy from the accused. And, to achieve this, the Inquisitors had a powerful tool at their disposal: torture. The use of torture was officially sanctioned, but it was governed by a set of diabolically clever rules. It was to be used only to extract a confession, not as a punishment in itself. And a victim was, officially, only to be subjected to one session of torture. However, the Inquisitors could simply suspend a session and resume it the next day, a legal fiction that allowed them to torture a victim repeatedly for weeks or months on end, all while technically adhering to their own rules. The methods were designed for maximum agony. The most common was the strappado, where the victim's hands were tied behind their back, attached to a rope on a pulley, and they were hoisted into the air, violent contrasting the frame from the crime. They would be left hanging in this excruciating position before being suddenly dropped, their fall stopped just short of the ground, sending waves of unimaginable pain through their bodies. Another favored method was the toca, or the water torture, where a cloth was forced down the victim's throat and water was slowly poured over it, giving them the constant, terrifying sensation of drowning. Throughout all of this, a scribe would sit calmly at a nearby table, meticulously recording every scream, every plea, and every word of the eventual broken confession. Once a confession was secured, the prisoner would languish in the dungeons until the day of the great public spectacle, the auto da fe, or act of faith. This was not a simple execution. It was a grand, theatrical production of religious power and state-sponsored terror. Massive procession would be held through the city. The condemned heretics would be marched barefoot, wearing their humiliating yellow San Benito robes, which were painted with images of flames and demons to signify their eternal damnation. They were led to the city's main plaza, where the king and queen themselves, along with all the great nobles and church officials, would be seated on a massive stage. A long mass would be held, and the sentences would be read aloud, one by one, over a period of hours. Those who had confessed and repented were granted a measure of mercy. They would be publicly whipped or sentenced to a lifetime of imprisonment. But those who refused to confess or who had relapsed into heresy were handed a different fate. They were officially relaxed to the secular authorities. This was the final, chilling euphemism. The church, which forbade itself from shedding blood, would hand the condemned over to the state to carry out the final punishment, being burned alive at the stake at a special execution ground known as the Quebec, or the burning place. But the diabolical purification of Spain was not limited to the Inquisition. In 1492, the same year they conquered the last Muslim kingdom of Granada and sent Christopher Columbus sailing across the Atlantic, Isabella and Ferdinand signed their most infamous decree, the Alhambra Decree, or the Edict of Expulsion. This decree gave every single Jewish person in the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon a stark and terrible choice: convert to Catholicism or leave the country forever. They were given just 4 months to either abandon their ancient faith or abandon their homes. Those who chose to leave were forced to sell their houses, their businesses, and their lands for a fraction of their true value, and they were forbidden from taking any gold, silver, or precious metals with them. It was an act of state-sponsored ethnic and religious cleansing. An estimated 100,000 Jews were forced into exile, a catastrophic brain drain and economic blow to Spain, but a necessary step, in the eyes of the monarchs, to create their perfectly unified Catholic kingdom. Isabella and Ferdinand were, in many ways, two of the most successful and brilliant monarchs in European history. They unified a fractured country, completed the Reconquista, and launched the age of global exploration, laying the foundations for the vast Spanish Empire. But their legacy is forever stained by their diabolical creation, the Spanish Inquisition, and the brutal religious intolerance it enforced. They were not depraved in the sense of personal sadism or sexual excess. Theirs was a far more dangerous depravity. They know that these concerns were not disturbed, but they had their own these. They know they had their own death, and they live the same. They were so utterly convinced that they were doing the work of God, so certain of their own righteousness, that they were willing to sanction the systematic torture and murder of thousands of their own subjects to save their souls and purify their kingdom. Their story is a terrifying reminder that some of history's most diabolical acts are committed not by monsters who believe in nothing, but by true believers who are absolutely certain they're on the side of the angels. In the early 1970s, the senior staff of the Mulago Hospital in Kampala, the capital of Uganda, were summoned to an urgent and terrifying meeting by their new president. They arrived at his office to find him seated at a table, calmly enjoying a meal. On a platter before him, kept in a state refrigerator, was a human head. It was the head of a political rival, a man who had dared to oppose him. The president, a hulking, charismatic man named Idi Amin Dada, wanted to make a point. This was just a glimpse into the bizarre and brutally diabolical reign of a man who would declare himself the conqueror of the British Empire and whose personal whims would plunge his nation into a nightmare of mass murder, economic collapse. To understand the monster, you must first understand the man. Idi Amin was born into humble beginnings in a small tribe in rural Uganda. Physically imposing, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, he was a man of immense natural strength, but little formal education. He found his calling not in the classroom, but in the army. He joined the King's African Rifles, the colonial army of the British Empire, initially serving as an assistant cook, before his raw power and aggression saw him promoted through the ranks. He was the heavyweight boxing champion of Uganda for 9 years, a gentle giant to his friends, and a terrifyingly effective brute to his enemies. This British commander noted both his good humor and his extreme, almost sadistic brutality during counterinsurgency operations and interrogations. When Uganda gained its independence in 1962, Amin's loyalty and connections allowed him to rise rapidly. The new Prime Minister, Milton Obote, saw Amin as a useful, if simple-minded tool. He promoted him to commander of the army. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Amin used his position to build a network of loyal soldiers, mostly from his own Kakwa ethnic group, and to enrich himself through the smuggling of ivory and gold from the neighboring Congo. By 1971, the relationship between the two men had soured. Obote, realizing he had created a rival too powerful to control, was preparing to have Amin arrested for corruption. But before he could act, Amin struck first. While Obote was out of the country attending a conference, Amin launched a swift and bloody military coup. He seized the capital, his soldiers slaughtered Obote's loyalists, and he declared himself the new president of Uganda. He was, at first, a figure of immense hope. He appeared on television as a friendly, charismatic soldier, a man of the people who promised to end corruption, release all political prisoners, and hold democracy. On the same day, Obote continued to step in and read our apprentices as corruption. He came back. The people of Uganda, tired of Obote's increasingly authoritarian rule, celebrated in the streets. Even Western governments, including Great Britain and Israel, welcomed the change, believing this simple pro-Western general would be a reliable ally in the Cold War. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. The mask of the benevolent liberator began to slip almost immediately. One of his first and most diabolical creations was a new secret police force. He gave it the deliberately boring and bureaucratic name, the State Research Bureau. In reality, this was his personal death squad, a gang of thugs and executioners who answered only to him. Their headquarters, the building in the Kampala suburb of Nakasero, became the most feared place in all of Uganda. It was a torture chamber on an industrial scale. Anyone suspected of disloyalty, former supporters of Obote, intellectuals, journalists, judges, and members of rival ethnic groups would be dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. They were taken to Nakasero and subjected to horrific torture. Victims were bludgeoned to death with sledgehammers, electrocuted, or dismembered. The State Research Bureau became a machine for processing human beings into corpses. The bodies were then often unceremoniously dumped into the Nile River, a convenient and gruesome disposal system. Amin would later joke that the crocodiles in the river were growing fat from feasting on his enemies. Having secured his power through terror, Amin then turned his attention to the nation's economy. In 1972, he made a stunning announcement that would seal his country's fate. He claimed he had a dream in which God had personally commanded him to expel the entire Asian minority from Uganda. The Ugandan Asians, many of whose families had been there for generations, were the backbone of the country's commercial and industrial economy. They were the shopkeepers, the bankers, and the entrepreneurs. Amin gave them just 90 days to leave the country, allowing them to take almost nothing with them. It was an act of diabolical racism and economic suicide. He seized their businesses, their homes, and their fortunes, and handed them over to his incompetent and corrupt military cronies, who quickly ran them into the ground. The expulsion of nearly 80,000 people triggered a complete and catastrophic collapse of the Ugandan economy. The shelves in the stores went bare, the infrastructure crumbled, and the nation spiraled into poverty. With his country purged and his death squads in place, Idi Amin's rule began to transform. The calculated political terror was now being supplemented by a deeply personal and bizarre form of megalomania. He would soon declare himself the conqueror of the British Empire and the uncrowned King of Scotland, and the world would watch in horrified fascination as the butcher of Uganda's reign entered its most surreal and bloody phase. Having purged his country of its economic engine and established his death squads as the ultimate authority in the land, Idi Amin's rule began to transform. The calculated, if brutal, political terror was now being supplemented by a deeply personal and bizarre form of megalomania. He saw himself not just as the president of Uganda, but as a towering figure on the world stage, a great man of history. And he began to give himself the titles to match. He officially declared himself His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas, and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular. This wasn't a joke. It was the official title he demanded to be addressed by. He would send rambling, semi-coherent telegrams to world leaders, offering advice to the British Queen on how to be a proper monarch, and wishing President Richard Nixon speedy recovery from Watergate. His public appearances became a form of surreal and menacing political theatre. In one infamous incident, he had 4 prominent white British businessmen living in Uganda carry him on a lavish throne in a public procession. The spectacle, he declared, was to show the world the white man's burden, a deeply ironic and humiliating display designed to mock his former colonial masters. He was a buffoon, but he was a buffoon with the power of life and death, and that made him terrifyingly unpredictable. But behind the public spectacle of his ego, his private life was descending into a much darker and more diabolical realm. Persistent and credible rumors began to emerge from defectors and former ministers who had fled his regime, rumors of a depravity that seemed to belong to a darker age. Cannibalism. Eyewitnesses who had been inside his palaces and command centers told horrifying stories. They claimed that he kept the severed heads of his most prominent political rivals in a large freezer. He would allegedly take the heads out, place them on the table, and have one-sided conversations with them, sometimes screaming at them for their betrayal, other times seeking their counsel. One of his former ministers later testified that Amin had personally boasted to him about his cannibalism, claiming that he had tasted human flesh but found it a bit too salty for his taste. The line between political murder and a personal ghoulish fetish had completely dissolved. He was not just killing his enemies, he was consuming them. His grandstanding on the world stage reached its climax in 1976. A group of Palestinian and German terrorists hijacked an Air France passenger jet carrying 248 people, diverting it to Entebbe Airport in Uganda. A large number of the passengers were Israeli or Jewish. Idi Amin, seeing an opportunity to cast himself as a major player in international affairs and a hero to the Arab world, personally welcomed the hijackers. He provided them with additional troops and weapons and allowed them to hold the hostages under the protection of his army. For a week, the world watched in terror. But on the night of July 4th, in one of the most daring special forces operations in history, Israeli commandos flew 4 transport planes over 2,500 miles, completely undetected, and landed at Entebbe. In a raid that lasted just 90 minutes, they stormed the terminal, killed the hijackers and dozens of Ugandan soldiers, and successfully rescued 102 of the hostages. It was a stunning military achievement, and for Idi Amin, it was a massive and catastrophic public humiliation. The buffoon, who called himself a great field marshal, had been completely outsmarted and overpowered on his own soil. His response was one of petty, impotent rage. He had his soldiers round up Dora Bloch, a 74-year-old hostage who had been taken to a local hospital before the raid, and had her dragged from her hospital bed and murdered. The Entebbe incident was the beginning of the end. His international prestige was shattered. The Ugandan economy was in a state of total collapse, and his own army, the very foundation of his power, was growing increasingly resentful and mutinous. In a final, desperate act of a cornered tyrant, he made a fatal mistake. In October of 1978, in an attempt to distract from his domestic problems and annex new territory, he launched a disastrous invasion of neighboring Tanzania. The Tanzanian army, led by President Julius Nyerere, a man Amin had repeatedly and publicly insulted, not only repelled the invasion, but, with the help of a growing army of exiled Ugandan forces, launched a full-scale counter-invasion. Amin's army, corrupt and demoralized, collapsed almost instantly. In April of 1979, as Tanzanian troops and Ugandan exiles closed in on the capital of Kampala, Idi Amin, the butcher of Uganda, the conqueror of the British Empire, gathered his family and a fleet of luxury cars and fled. The most infuriating part of Idi Amin's diabolical story is its final chapter. He was never brought to justice. After fleeing Uganda, he was given refuge by his friend, the Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, and then was granted a comfortable and permanent exile in the city of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. He lived out the final decades of his life in quiet luxury, enjoying a generous government stipend, swimming, and watching television. He died peacefully of kidney failure in a hospital bed in 2003. He left behind a nation that was utterly traumatized and economically destroyed. The number of his own people who were murdered during his 8-year reign is estimated to be somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000. His diabolical nature was a unique and terrifying blend of shrewd political brutality, comical showmanship, and a deeply personal, almost criminal cruelty. His unthinkable creation was a state that ran on the daily, unpredictable whims of a single man, a regime where the line between a political purge and a cannibal feast was horrifyingly and permanently blurred. They were known as the Tonton Macoute, a name taken from a Haitian Creole folktale of a terrifying uncle bogeyman who kidnaps naughty children and carries them away in a sack. They wore dark sunglasses to hide their eyes. They drove menacing black jeeps, and they were responsible for the torture, disappearance, and murder of tens of thousands of Haitians. But their greatest weapon was not their guns or their razor-sharp machetes. It was a belief. They actively cultivated the image of being something more than human. They were whispered to be supernatural demons, sorcerers who were immune to bullets, who could read minds, and who could even return from the dead. This was the diabolical creation of their absolute master, a quiet, bespectacled, and unassuming country doctor named Francois Duvalier. He was a man who would transform himself from Papa Doc, a beloved physician, into the living embodiment of the voodoo spirit of death, and in doing so, would plunge his island nation into a 14-year-long nightmare of supernatural terror. To understand the monster, you must first understand the man and the culture he would so expertly twist. Francois Duvalier was, by all accounts, a brilliant and studious man. He trained as a physician and spent years working in the poor rural countryside, fighting infectious diseases like yaws and typhus. It was here that he earned the affectionate nickname, Papa Doc, a man of the people who understood their suffering. It was also here that he developed a deep and profound understanding of Haiti's soul, the syncretic religion of Vodou, or voodoo. He was also a passionate black nationalist, a key figure in the intellectual movement known as negritude, which celebrated black consciousness and rejected the dominance of the light-skinned, French-speaking mulatto elite who had ruled Haiti for most of its history. He saw voodoo not as a primitive superstition, but as the authentic, powerful, and deeply ingrained spiritual expression of the Haitian people, a tool that could be used to forge a new national identity. In 1957, Duvalier ran for president on a populist, black nationalist platform. He promised to empower the country's poor, rural, black majority. He won the election, and the people celebrated the rise of one of their own. They had no idea they had just elected a man who would become their high priest of terror. After surviving an early coup attempt in 1958, Duvalier made a crucial decision. He could no longer trust the regular army. He needed a force whose loyalty was absolute and personal. So he created his own. He called them the Sound, Volunteers for National Security, or VSN. But they would become universally known by their terrifying folkloric name, the Tong Tong Makut. This was his first diabolical creation. The Makut were not a formal army. They were a sprawling network of spies, thugs, and true believers that extended into every neighborhood, every village, every workplace in Haiti. They had no official salary. They were encouraged to make their living through corruption and extortion, a practice known as Duvalierism. Their numbers swelled to include thousands of members, from poor, illiterate peasants to high-ranking voodoo priests. And their loyalty was not to the state of Haiti, but to one man alone, Papa Doc. But it was how Duvalier fused this new force with his manipulation of voodoo that was truly diabolical. He began to systematically and deliberately cultivate an image of himself, not just as a president, but as a powerful bokor, a voodoo sorcerer. He understood that in a country where the spiritual world and the physical world were deeply intertwined, supernatural fear could be a far more potent weapon than mere political oppression. He began to model his public persona on the most feared and respected figure in the voodoo pantheon, Baron Samedi, the low, or spirit, of the dead. Baron Samedi is the guardian of the cemetery, a figure who is both terrifying and comical, a master of death who is also a lover of obscene jokes and debauchery. Duvalier adopted the Baron's traditional attire. He would appear in public, dressed in a black top hat and tails, wearing dark, round sunglasses, and speaking in a slow, eerie, and distinctly nasal tone, deliberately imitating the way the spirit is said to speak when he possesses a devotee. The message was clear and terrifying. The president of Haiti and the lord of the dead were one and the same. His Tonton Makut became the earthly extension of this supernatural power. They were his demons, his zombies. They were encouraged to act with unpredictable, almost insane brutality, to further the idea that they were not bound by human laws. They would often kill their victims and leave their bodies on public display, sometimes hanging from lampposts to rot in the sun as a warning to others. Duvalier used specific, macabre events to cement his legend as a sorcerer. After his main political rival died of a heart attack, Duvalier publicly boasted that he had killed the man using a voodoo curse. He then allegedly had the man's heart cut out and brought to him at the presidential palace. He claimed he needed to commune with his defeated enemy spirit to absorb his power. Whether this actually happened is almost irrelevant. The story spread like wildfire, and the people believed it. Having successfully merged the absolute power of a modern dictator with the supernatural authority of a voodoo god, Papa Doc's control over the nation of Haiti became total. His face was everywhere. His spies were in every village. The Catholic Catechism was even rewritten to praise him instead of God. with passages like Mini Salva, Our Doc, who art in the National Palace for life, hallowed be thy name. But this cult of personality was just the foundation. The next phase of his diabolical rule would be a wave of purges and disappearances that would turn his island nation into a landscape of silent, paralyzing fear. Having successfully merged the absolute power of a modern dictator with the supernatural authority of a voodoo god, Papa Doc Duvalier's control over the nation of Haiti became total. His face, hidden behind dark sunglasses, stared out from posters in every town square. His spies, the Tonton Macoute, were in every village, their presence a constant, silent threat. But this cult of personality was just the foundation. The next phase of his diabolical rule would be a long and bloody reign of terror. A series of purges and disappearances designed to eliminate any and every conceivable threat to his power. He was a man who trusted no one. He systematically purged the military, executing any officer he suspected of harboring even the slightest hint of disloyalty. He turned on the very men who had helped him seize power, one by one, imprisoning or killing them to ensure that no one could ever rise to challenge him. He even periodically purged the leadership of the Tonton Macoute itself, a brutal message to his own enforcers that even they were not indispensable. His cruelty was both systematic and deeply personal. In 1964, after a group of 13 exiled Haitians attempted a small-scale invasion, Duvalier's response was a diabolical act of collective punishment. He declared the entire town of Jérémie, where some of the rebels were from, to be a tight no-go zone. He unleashed his Macoute on the town in an event that became known as the Brickin' Jérémie Vespers. They went from house to house, not just killing the immediate family members of the known rebels, but their distant relatives as well, from the elderly down to the infants. It was an extermination of entire family lines, a clear and terrifying message that opposition to Papa Doc would result in the complete erasure of your bloodline from the earth. But his most audacious move was to turn his voodoo-infused power outward against the most powerful man in the world, the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. The Kennedy administration, appalled by Duvalier's rampant corruption and horrific human rights abuses, had cut off most of the American aid that was propping up his regime. Duvalier, furious, decided to fight back, not with diplomacy, but with magic. He publicly declared that he had placed a powerful voodoo curse on President Kennedy. He held elaborate, nighttime ceremonies in the presidential palace, where he would stab pins into a voodoo doll of his American rival. On the day of Kennedy's assassination in Dallas in November of 1963, Duvalier claimed to have been in the middle of a ritual. He immediately took full credit for the president's death. In the United States, it was seen as the pathetic ranting of a petty dictator. But in Haiti, among a populace that deeply believed in the power of voodoo, the message was received with terrified awe. Papa Doc was not just the master of Haiti. He was a sorcerer, so powerful he could strike down the leader of the free world from thousands of miles away. His supernatural legend was now absolute. With his power solidified, he moved to make it permanent. In 1964, he held a sham referendum on a new constitution. The only options on the ballot were yes and yes. The official result was a 99.9% vote in favor of making him president for life. He was now a king in all but name. The cult of personality reached its zenith. The Lord's Prayer was famously rewritten by his propagandists to read, Our Doc, who art in the National Palace for life, hallowed be thy name by present and future generations. His final depraved creation was a dynasty, As his own health began to fail from heart disease and diabetes, he needed to ensure his system of terror would outlive him. He rewrote the Constitution again, lowering the required age for the presidency from 40 to 18, and he designated his overweight, quiet, and largely uninterested 19-year-old son, Jean-Claude, as his successor. He was creating a Republican dynasty, a system designed to pass the title of president for life from father to son. Throughout his reign, he systematically plundered the Haitian economy. He was a vampire, bleeding his own country dry. He siphoned off tens of millions of dollars in international aid and government revenues into his personal Swiss bank accounts. But his most ghoulish enterprise earned him the nickname, the Fog's Fate, the Vampire of the Caribbean. He created a national medical institution, supposedly to provide blood and plasma for the Haitian people. In reality, he was using it to buy blood from his impoverished, malnourished citizens for as little as $3 a pint, and then selling that blood plasma abroad, primarily to the United States and Germany, for a massive profit. He was literally selling the blood of his own people to enrich himself. Unlike so many of the tyrants on our list, Francois Papadoc Duvalier was never overthrown. He died peacefully in office of natural causes in 1971, and he was successful in passing his diabolical system of control on to his son, Baby Doc Jean-Claude, who would continue to rule and plunder Haiti for another 15 years. Papadoc's legacy is the complete and utter ruin of a nation. His 14-year reign is estimated to have been responsible for the deaths of between 30,000 and 60,000 Haitians. He destroyed the country's political institutions, terrorized its civil society, and created a cycle of poverty, corruption, and instability that persists to this very day. His diabolical genius was his understanding that in a country steeped in spiritual belief, psychological terror, built on a foundation of supernatural fear, could be far more effective than military force alone. His unthinkable creation was a totalitarian state run on the principles of black magic, a regime where the secret police were seen as demons and the president was the living lord of the dead. In the human imagination, hell is a place of fire and torment, of agonized screams that echo for eternity through chambers of suffering. For most of history, this has been a metaphor, a religious warning of a fate that awaits in the afterlife. But in the 6th century BC, on the sun-drenched and wealthy island of Sicily, a diabolical ruler decided to bring this hell to earth. He was the tyrant of the Greek city-state of Akragas, part of his first phase of solitude, sorrow. All for 60 years later, the gods are tied to values. And then the triumph of Caesar and Bailey are and his unthinkable creation, a masterpiece of art and agony, would allow him to listen to the sounds of his victims being roasted alive and hear it as music. The story of Phalaris is a dark tale from the dawn of Western civilization, a time when the Greek world was expanding across the Mediterranean. The colony of Akragas on the southern coast of Sicily was a place of immense wealth and opportunity, but it was also a place of intense political instability, a perfect environment for an ambitious and utterly ruthless man to seize power. Phalaris was just such a man. The historical accounts of his rise are a lesson in cunning and betrayal. He was given a position of great public trust, tasked with overseeing the construction of a magnificent new temple on the city's Acropolis, the high fortified ground that served as its religious and military heart. He was given access to the state treasury to fund the project. But Phalaris had no intention of building a temple to the gods. He was building a temple to himself. He used the state funds to hire a massive personal army of mercenaries and loyal bodyguards. He also cleverly armed a large number of prisoners and slaves, promising them their freedom in exchange for their loyalty to him. Then, during a religious festival, when the citizens of Akragas were distracted and unarmed, he made his move. He unleashed his private army, stormed the Acropolis, and seized control of the city in a bloody coup. He declared himself the Tyrant of Akragas. Any citizen who had opposed him, or whose wealth he coveted, was either executed or driven into exile. His rule, from its very inception, was built on a foundation of terror and intimidation. But it was not enough for Phalaris to simply wield power. He seemed to derive a dark, artistic satisfaction from displays of elaborate cruelty. He became known throughout the Greek world for his inventive and sadistic punishments, always seeking new and more theatrical ways to inflict suffering on those who displeased him. It was in this climate of absolute power and pathological cruelty that the infamous Brazen Bull was conceived. The creation of this monstrous device is attributed to a renowned and noble prey where the god's power is to enjoy, the prey of the godly self and the sadness of the spirit, and the cry of the Savior is filled with anger. He was a master of his craft, an artist who understood that the favor of a tyrant was the surest path to fame and fortune. He approached Phalaris with a proposition, a design for a novel form of execution, one that would be both terrifyingly effective and aesthetically pleasing to the tyrant's twisted sensibilities. Phalaris envisioned a life-size statue of a bull, hollow on the inside, crafted entirely from gleaming, polished bronze. It would be a magnificent work of art, a symbol of power and virility. But it would have a secret. A door, cleverly hidden on the bull's flank, would allow a condemned prisoner to be placed inside. The door would then be sealed shut, locking the victim in the dark, metallic belly of the beast. A great fire would then be lit beneath the bull. As the flames licked the bronze, the metal would begin to glow red-hot, slowly, agonizingly, roasting the person trapped within to a gruesome death. But the true genius of Phalaris's design, the diabolical element that elevated it from a mere instrument of torture to a work of performance art, lay in its acoustics. The bull's head was to be constructed with a complex system of pipes and tubes, all leading from the main chamber to the bull's nostrils. This intricate apparatus was ingeniously designed to capture and modulate the sound of the victim's screams. As the person inside cried out in unimaginable pain, their screams would travel through the pipes, being transformed and amplified, emerging from the bull's mouth not as human shrieks, but as a sound that perfectly mimicked the powerful, enraged bellowing of a real bull. Phalaris, in presenting his creation to Phalaris, reportedly boasted that the final sounds from his machine were sweetest, most pathetic of all music. Phalaris, a connoisseur of cruelty, was utterly captivated by the idea. He saw in the Brazen Bull the perfect fusion of terror and entertainment, a way to publicly execute his enemies while simultaneously providing a morbid and unforgettable spectacle for the citizens of Akragas. He lavishly praised Phalaris for his diabolical ingenuity and commissioned the bull to be built immediately. And the sense of terror, love, and cry, once completed, the magnificent and terrifying bronze statue was placed in a prominent location, a constant gleaming reminder of the tyrant's absolute power and the agonizing fate that awaited anyone who dared to cross him. The ball was finished. The stage was set. But Phalaris, ever the suspicious and capricious ruler, was curious to test the acoustic properties of his new toy firsthand. He turned to the proud inventor, Phalaris of Athens. He praised the artist's genius, but noted that a mere description of the bull's music was not enough. Before he could use it on others, he needed a proper demonstration. The tyrant smiled, his eyes gleaming with a cold, appreciative light. He had just one question for the inventor. Would he be willing to demonstrate? The artist Phalaris of Athens, beaming with pride at the praise of the tyrant, eagerly agreed to demonstrate his creation's acoustic genius. He explained to Phalaris how a man's screams would be transformed into the bellowing of a bull. But Phalaris, feigning a scientific curiosity, insisted that a mere verbal description was insufficient. "You," he said to Phalaris, "are the only one who truly understands the mechanics of this device. Climb inside and imitate for me the sound of a man screaming in agony, so that I may know if the sound that emerges will be as musical as you claim." Eager to please his powerful new patron, Phalaris did as he was told. He crawled through the small door on the flank of the bronze beast and entered the dark metallic belly of his own creation. But the moment he was inside, the smile on Phalaris's face vanished. "You have shown me your art," the tyrant reportedly said. "Now, it is only fair that you be the first to display its most notable quality." At his command, his guards slammed the heavy bronze door shut and bolted it from the outside. The inventor was now a prisoner. Then, Phalaris gave the final, horrific order: light the fires. As the flames began to lick at the bronze underbelly of the bull, the metal began to heat up. The muffled sounds from within the statue soon began. But as Phalaris had promised, they were not the recognizable screams of a man. They were transformed by the intricate pipes within the bull's head into a deep, guttural, and horrifyingly lifelike roar. The Brazen Bull bellowed, its first music, the sound of its own creator, being roasted alive. Phalaris, it was said, listened with a cold and satisfied detachment. He had his proof. The machine worked perfectly. But in a final act of cruel and twisted logic, he did not allow Phalaris to be completely incinerated. Before the inventor was dead, Phalaris had the fires extinguished and the door unsealed. He had the half-dead, horrifically burned Phalaris dragged from the bull's belly. The tyrant did not believe that such a diabolical artist deserved to have his final resting place be within his own noble creation. And so, he had Phalaris carried to the top of a high cliff and thrown to his death on the rocks below. The Brazen Bull was now consecrated in the suffering of its own maker, and it became the enduring symbol of Phalaris's diabolical reign. For 16 years, he ruled Akragas through a regime of absolute terror, and a bull was his favorite instrument. Any citizen who was suspected of plotting against him, any political rival who grew too popular, any wealthy merchant whose fortune he coveted, could find themselves condemned to the bull. The terrifying metallic bellowing echoing from the Acropolis became a familiar sound in the city, a constant, auditory reminder of the tyrant's power and the price of dissent. The legends of his cruelty grew. He was accused of being a cannibal, of eating suckling infants to satisfy his depraved appetites. He became the archetypal tyrant in the Greek imagination, a man so completely corrupted by power that he had lost all humanity. But a reign built on such monstrous foundations cannot last forever. The fear and hatred that Phalaris had so carefully cultivated among his subjects eventually boiled over. A popular uprising, led by a nobleman named Telemachus, who was an ancestor of the great philosopher Empedocles, finally challenged the tyrant's rule. The citizens of Akragas, no longer willing to live under the shadow of the Brazen Bull, stormed the Acropolis. Phalaris's mercenaries were overwhelmed, and the tyrant, who had tortured and killed so many, was finally captured. The citizens of Akragas, in their moment of liberation, decided that the only fitting end for their tormentor was a dose of his own medicine. In the ultimate act of poetic justice, they dragged Phalaris to his own diabolical creation. They forced him through the small door, sealed him inside the cold, dark belly of his Brazen Bull, and for the last time, they lit the fires. The man who had commissioned the bull, the man who had delighted in its horrifying music, was now its final victim. The screams that had once been his entertainment were now his own. Phalaris and his Brazen Bull have passed into the realm of legend, becoming enduring symbols of extreme cruelty and the diabolical imagination of tyrants. While the historical accuracy of some of the more lurid details may be debated by scholars, the core image of a ruler who roasted his victims alive within a screaming bronze statue remains one of the most potent and horrifying in all of ancient history. His unthinkable creation was not just a method of execution. It was a performance of terror, a deliberate and artistic fusion of suffering and spectacle, designed to solidify his power through sheer, visceral fear. His story is a grim reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the enduring fascination we have for those rulers who seem to take a diabolical pleasure in the infliction of unimaginable pain. The bellowing of the Brazen Bull, whether real or a legend forged in the terror of his reign, continues to echo through the corridors of history, a chilling testament to a tyrant whose name is forever linked with one of the most diabolical instruments of torture ever conceived. From the screaming bronze bull of a Greek tyrant to the quiet, smiling face of a genocidal maniac, we have journeyed into the minds of history's most diabolical rulers. Their stories are a chilling testament to the fact that absolute power, in the hands of a twisted mind, will always find a way to create its own personal hell on Earth. Which of these rulers' diabolical acts did you find the most shocking? And is there a terrifying tyrant we missed? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this journey into the heart of darkness compelling, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more.